So if the topmost misconception is about the age of Aisha radiallahu anha, the second misconception regarding women amongst Muslims is the issue of female circumcision. And it is said that it was allowed by Imam Shafi'i or some of his followers. And there is a hadith actually. Again, there is a hadith which says it is something which is recommended for women. It is something which is mandatory for men, for boys, and recommendation for girls. Makramatum min nisa, the Arabic words are. Now this narrative, when I researched, it's not me researching for the first time. This narrative is an absolutely inauthentic narrative. It does not hold water, it does not hold ground. It's not reliably traced back to the Prophet. The established sunnah of the Prophet is that only the male child is to be circumcised. There is absolutely no concept of female circumcision, and genital mutilation is the name that I can think of whenever someone says that there's a thing as female circumcision. So this was a tribal practice in Africa, in some other countries. This still, is going on unchecked. But as far as Islam is concerned, it is absolutely erroneous to say that it goes for or it has any hand in female circumcision. There is not the slightest doubt that as far as circumcision is concerned, it was prescribed only and only for the male child. And because of the fact that there is a narrative which is weak, and because of the fact that there is a group of scholars amongst Muslims who think that this is a recommended practice, it doesn't mean that the Prophet himself also said so. And this actually also highlights another fact, and that is that not only we revere narratives which are found in Bukhari and which are technically could be regarded as Sahih, but even weak narratives, even narratives which are not soundly traced back to the Prophet, they are also venerated by us, by Muslims. And this is actually what we call our hadith-centric attitude of our scholars, in which whenever something is recorded in the name of the Prophet, even if it's not authentic, they still try to sort of, adjust it in Muslim directives. And this is, I think, more to do with our hadith-centric notion which has developed in the last 200 years in Muslims, amongst Muslims. And today, anything which goes by in the name of the Prophet, even if it is not authentic, and if you think that I'm doing something, I'm saying something which might not be correct, I can invite you to go and read, for example, Imam Ghazali. His Ihya Ulumuddin is one of the greatest books which is regarded to be one of the greatest books of Muslim sciences and Muslim academics. And you'll find that Imam Ghazali has used and actually adopted many zaif ahadith, which means weak and concocted even. And he says that, well, as far as the fazail are concerned, or calling people to reward is concerned, even if we use these weak ahadith, it is fine, because they are not going to add anything to the Sharia. All that they're doing is they're trying to inspire Muslims to do good deeds. For example, if you say that, well, if you recite this kalama for such and such a time, then you'll be given the sawab of a hajj. Or if you do this, you'll be given this. So a host of these narratives you'll find are the ones which Imam Ghazali has cited in his Ihya. And mind you, Imam Ghazali's fame and his authority and his personality is really something which you can find in amongst Muslims as to be a towering personality, a person who's really revered. And after the Prophet, a few personalities amongst Muslims which are non-prophets, if you can count them, then one of them is Imam Ghazali. So such is his potent influence that even weak narratives have been, given space in our minds. And this narrative about female circumcision is, of course, not about fazail or reward. It's actually something which adds a directive in the Sharia, and it cannot be accepted at all. And so it's a big stigma on the face of Islam, and Islam does not say anything in support of it. So I always try to clarify this misconception, because in a non-Muslim audience, you'll find this something to be very talked about. And I think even if it's not a non-Muslim audience, if I count myself as a seeker of the truth, to me also this would look very odd. For any normal inquiring person, female circumcision would be an issue that would be a problematic issue in his or her mind, I would say. The third misconception, again in the same order, I'm trying to narrate these misconceptions in the order that I find in the society, especially non-Muslims and even amongst Muslims, is the issue of slavery. or the issue of keeping slave women and having intimacy with them. And so the classical concept today is that today if there is a war and if you conquer if you conquer women from the opposite side, it could be their soldiers or it could be their paramedical or paramilitary staff, which is like the nurses who are, for example, taking care of the sick. If you capture them, then you can have intimate relations with them. And I remember of an incident in my university days many years ago. So I was studying in my engineering course, and one of my professors was a physics professor, a very reputed Stanford graduate. Yeah, he was teaching us physics, and this is I distinctly remember this was 1984. That's almost 40 years ago, and there was a chance that India and Pakistan might have a war, because that there was a time that war exercises were going on the border of India and Pakistan, and every day we used to get this breaking news that, well, they are on the borders and the armies are gathering there. Pakistan has gathered their army and the Indians have gathered their army. So there was this always a talked about chance of, maybe some of you might be remembering, this was 1984, just before her assassination. So our physics professor, I'm not going to name him, he passed away some years ago, and he was a brilliant professor in his subject. He came to our class and he said that, I'm going to repeat his sentence in Urdu. He said that कि अगर जंग होती है पाकिस्तान और हिंदुस्तान के दरमियान, तो मैंने इंदिरा गांधी को अपनी लौंडी बनाना. And all of us were shocked. I mean, हमारा ख्याल था, we thought कि this is a notion which is confined to the religious people only, or the mullahs. But he was not a mullah at all. He was a modern, very well-educated Stanford graduate. He's a very distinguished person. And he coming up in the class, and before even commencing the class, he just uttered this sentence which took us unaware, and we were flabbergasted actually. But the point that I'm trying to convey here is that as far as the issue of slavery is concerned, such is its all-pervasive nature, that not only our clergy, not only our religious scholars, but even distinguished minds, they also think that if there is a war between a Muslim country and a non-Muslim country, and if you capture their ladies or their women from among their military staff maybe, or from their nursing, or even if they're fighting, because even women fight today as soldiers, then you can have intimate relations with them. And they bring their arguments from the Prophet's lives, of course, and because of the fact that the Prophet also had a maiden or a slave girl called Maria Qibtiyya, who was sent to her as a gift by the king of Egypt. And even before that, we know that all the Sahaba, or most of the Sahaba, they had these slave maidens, as they call them. And even before them, we find the Quran telling us that you can have sexual intimacy with your slave maidens. So we find the Quran speaking of them as illa ala azwajihim aw ma malakat aymanuhum. So milke yamin is the word which the Quran used, or what your right hand possesses. This is an Arabic idiom for having a maiden or a slave maiden with whom you can have intimacy. This is just an expression. Otherwise, the Quran also speaks of it. So now the question is that if this is what the Quran says, that slavery is still rampant or still practiced, and even today you can make slaves of women who are to be captured, and without marrying them, mind you, it's not marrying them. Without marrying them, you can have relations with them as if they were prostitutes. Out of marriage, you can still, go close to them. So this is what our stated classical Muslim stance is, and they actually take their argument from the Prophet and from the Quran, because in the Meccan period we find the verses in the Quran, like for example Surah Al-Ma'arij, and we find Surah Mu'minun saying that you cannot have sexual intimacy with anyone except your wife and your slave lady. Illa ala azwajihim, except their wives, aw ma malakat aymanuhum, or their slave ladies. With all the rest, you are permitted to have sexual relations. You're not permitted except for these two, your wives and your slave ladies. So now the question is that, is this what the Quran teaches us or tells us, that yes, slavery is something that we still can practice, and is this one of the motivations that many of our Jawans, they go to become an army personnel and fight for the cause of God? So the answer is a big no, once again. And the reason here is that it has been grossly misinterpreted. And this misinterpretation is again a result of not understanding how the Quran went about gradually eliminating this inhuman institution. Slavery was not something which was instituted by Islam in any way. It was inherited by Islam. When the Quran was being revealed, slaves, scores of them, already existed. And not just in the time of the Quran, it's in the time of Jahiliyyah, hundreds of years before the Prophet. Slavery was rampant. Slavery was rampant in the land of Arabia. So what you can say is that actually Islam or the Quran inherited slavery. It inherited slavery, and because of the fact that slavery was very, very deeply rooted in the Muslim society. So slavery basically was something which Islam inherited, as I said, the Quran inherited, and because of the fact that it was a age-old institution, 300, 400 years, or even much before that, we find it being mentioned even in the Old Testament. So it was an institution which was a very, very age-old institution. It had a very deep roots in the Arab society. So something which has a very deep root anywhere, you just cannot, with just one blemish of your pen, proscribe it or prohibit it. Something which is very deeply rooted, you have to gradually eliminate it. You have to set people's minds right and then come to, think of how you have to eliminate it. So this is precisely what happened in the time of the Quran. There were two sources of slavery. One was, of course, wars, and the other were slave markets. They would be purchased, and of course there were. If you look at the times of the Sahaba, there were slaves who could be brought from, who could be actually conquered in the war and then made slaves, slave women, and they were slaves which were already there in the times, in pre-Islamic times, and they inherited them because of the fact that their fathers or their mothers, they left behind them, and they had no other place to go but to live with their heirs. So we had these two sources, and one, present slaves which were living in the Sahaba's houses. The Prophet, as I said, he was also gifted a slave lady, and the other was that if there would be a war, then new slaves could also be made. So first of all, what the Quran did was that it stopped the means from this in which this new slavery could be made, and it said explicitly in the Quran, in Surah Muhammad, and this was revealed very close to the Battle of Badr. It says, and that was the first battle which took place between the Muslims and the idolaters. The Quran explicitly said that you cannot make anyone as your slave as soon as this war starts. And it said, Imma mannam baradu, imma fidal. You have to set them free either with ransom or without ransom. But you cannot make them slaves. And this is something which is for all times to come. So you can see the fact that you could have more slaves from wars, the door for this was closed. No more slaves could have been inducted in anyone's harem. Every new prisoner of war who would be captured in war had to be set free, either on ransom or without ransom. Or of course, if there were war crimes that he had committed, he could be punished for that. But he or she could not be made a slave, neither a male slave or a female slave. So now in Medina, when this Battle of Badr took place, you can see that one thing which the Quran did was that it actually closed the doors of any new slave being made, because it said that you cannot capture them as slaves, you have to set them free. You can designate them as prisoners of war, but you cannot call them as your slaves. They cannot be subjected to the same treatment. This is one big directive which the Quran gave, and that was in the Medinan period. But much before that, in the Meccan period, when slavery was still being practiced, and of course it was something which Islam had inherited, the Quran actually made this appeal that liberate the necks of these slaves. Do not keep them with you. This is something which is inhuman. It did not make it obligatory. It actually appealed to the Muslim nations or to the Muslims that please set them free, emancipate them in the name of God. The words used by the Quran are fakku rakaba. Liberate the necks. Rakaba is your neck. Fakku rakaba, just set them free. And the appeal found in this word can be understood. And when you say that the neck is grasped by you, you set it free. And then a host of other measures were taken. For example, Muslims were told that whatever they eat, whatever they wear, whatever the standard of living, they should give the same standard of living to their slaves, thereby making it difficult for them to maintain slaves. I mean, how can I maintain myself and my slave with the same standard of living? So the stress was to have them liberated, because if you cannot treat them in the same way, then you liberate them. Then the psyche was changed, and you were not allowed to call them by the word slave. The Arabic word slave, which is abd and amma. Abd is for slave, and amma is for slave woman. It was proscribed that you could not call them as abd and amma, which means the slave lady and the slave girl. It was told that you must call them as a boy or a girl. The same words have to be used for them as for any free boy or girl or free man or woman. And similarly, a lot of other crimes which were committed, and as a result of that, the atonement of those crimes was prescribed. So one of the atonements which was prescribed was to set free a slave. For example, if you ended up killing someone, or the zihar crime, for example, or some of the other things that the Quran has mentioned, in order to atone for those sins, the Quran says that you must set free a slave. Again, directing its impetus to the fact that yes, this is an area in which you are being appealed to set free these slaves. Right until the last, when I would say around 10th Hijrah, when a directive was revealed from Surah Nur, which said that every single slave who wanted to get herself or himself freed must be set free if he or she guarantees a certain sum of money, which would mean that he or she would not be a burden on the society and would work as an independent person. And for that, the Quran used the words katibuhum. If they ask for their emancipation, you have to grant them. You cannot just say no to them. So in other words, what happened was that the Quran adopted a gradual process of elimination of slavery. For new slaves, it immediately closed the doors when it said that you cannot make any prisoner of war as a slave as soon as the first battle started. For slaves which already existed in the houses of Sahaba, for them this gradual strategy was adopted, and later on, finally, when people got used to it, in the 10th of Hijrah, this order was given that if any slave asks you for his or her own emancipation, you have to set him or her free. And then, of course, only those slaves were left in the houses of the Prophet or the Sahaba, who themselves did not want to go away, who had spent a lifetime there, and who wanted to stay there as people who had gone old in those houses. So only those slaves were left, and of course out of their own will. So this is how the Quran actually eliminated slavery. Only in the time that it allowed slavery, or that gradual implementation time, which we call the interim time, in which this institution was allowed, were these verses revealed that yes, you can have intimacy with your wives and your slave ladies, because this is the period in which these interim directives have been given. But once these interim directives were finished, they got away. The final directive which was given was that you have to set them free. Then this was no longer a choice. You had to set them free at all costs. So I've just very briefly alluded to this whole exercise by the Quran, and I can tell you that the reason of this misconception is that the interim directive which was given during the time the slavery was allowed and was being gradually eliminated, it somehow got stuck, and people thought that instead of regarding it to be an interim directive for that interim period, they thought that it was a directive for all times to come. And even today, if there is a war, we can capture women for this purpose. So they did not perhaps understand that if the Quran was allowing slavery for a particular period of time, in those 10 or 15 years, it was because of that interim period in which slavery was being gradually eliminated. In that gradual period, you had to uphold that. But as soon as that period expired, this directive was absolutely operational, that you could simply not do that. So this is how the Quran has actually described that slavery was proscribed, was prohibited, and it cannot be in any way carried on. And therefore, a person who interprets these verses in a way that you think that it's for all times to come is actually not understanding the stress. What he is doing is he is making that interim period, which was just an interim period, seem like a period which is going to extend till the day of judgment. Again, the problem here was that by not understanding the interim directive, you have extended that interim directive as a directive for all times to come, whereas the Quran, in that gradual period, gave that time so that people could become used to this and slowly start liberating slaves out of their own. And finally, when this was no longer the case, then an order was given that if a slave wants to get free, then you just cannot come in his way. So this is what the Quran has established, and I've just summarized what my Ustaz is. Ustaz Amin Asar Islahi, you must be knowing his name. To me, he's the first person who pointed out this the way I've just described it to you in a very brief way. And he said that, look, what the Quran is telling us a different story, and unfortunately, people are telling a different story.
In which surah did this occur?
Surah Nur is the 24th surah. You're talking about the final directive?
No, the first.
The first is Surah Mu'minun. This is the 23rd surah, and Surah Al-Mawrid, which is the 70th surah. So the point that I'm making is that the Quran had allowed it in that interim period in which that gradual elimination was taking place. Obviously, you had to uphold that. But once that gradual elimination got to an end, it totally put an end to it.
But I think this particular tradition, I would call it, practice, it still prevails.
It still prevails because they still think it's something which is operational. You see, what has happened is that instead of regarding that Quranic directive to relate to that interim period, they think that it is for all times to come. And the other thing is that they see Hadith literature as well, in which even people after the Sahaba, they kept on waging wars, kept on capturing maidens, prisoners of war, and making them as slaves. So anything which is being done by a later period, after the Sahaba, is not responsibility for us to explain. So what has happened is that by not understanding the fact that if history or Hadith literature is preserving this institution in a certain way, they thought that it has not been done away with. And we have, as far as the interim verses are concerned, they are not interim. Otherwise, had they been interim, why would the later Sahaba and the later Tabi'un would have indulged in this practice in the first place?
Where this popular term haram?
Yeah, which is going. That's how
The haram is
Haram means the
popular
place where all these maidens are kept. It's called a sacred place. Just harim, the word same is harim, which means that a place that only the husband can enter, a place where only his own private or personal belongings are kept. This is what it means. But it came to imply an area or a group of women who belong to a certain man, whether they are his wives or his concubines.
So we can say this is against the Quran thing?
It is against the Quran, absolutely. I just told you that look at my physics professor. He was not a religious person, but he was intent. He wanted to make Indira Gandhi as a slave, and this is how the Muslim psyche is working. And this is one area again in which we have to once again revisit this concept. And when I say revisit, I don't think that it is a wise thing to do it with our scholars or ulama, because they are hell-bent, they have made up their minds. I think again here the stress is to talk to open minds to people who would like to think about these things once again, to rethink them, to revisit them, and to present the counter narrative, I would say.
And is it true that basically in Saudi Arabia or these countries that these women are treated equally, or they are given the benefit of having a comfortable life or whatever, and they still remain?
There's so many things which are said about Saudi Arabia, and slowly it is coming out because it's a closed society. There's so many things which people have gone there and tried to assess. But what I can say is that once someone becomes a slave of someone, the particular sheikh or the husband would not allow her to marry someone else. So he might divorce her or send her away. By sending away, I would mean that he would not have relations with her, but she would not be allowed to go to someone else. She would be kept in the confines of his own house. So,
Yeah.
and yes, treatment might be better, but again, it is something which is done against their will. You see, there could be nothing worse than subjecting people to one's own whims against their will. So if they don't want to enter your harem, and you are doing it in a way that forcefully makes them do so, it is something which is absolutely against.
And do you think the male servants are they considered as servants or are they considered as ghulam?
No, they are servants.
They are
Because they are entirely different category. And you see, in the times of the Prophet, the ghulams were as if you have bought them. They were like possessions because they were simply sold as commodities in various places. You would buy them and they would be, at your disposal for 24 hours. But today, when you hire someone as a domestic servant, you are hiring a servant and he has certain rights. He will work for 8 hours or 12 hours. He'll have a pay raise,
for it, and then
etc.
you get
etc.
paid for it.
And you pay for it exactly,
Yeah, the
like
ghulam
services.
doesn't
No,
receive any compensation.
and your question actually reminds me of another thing, and that is there is again this huge misconception which prevails in some of our Pakistani Muslim men, that they think that their their maids which would work for their children or maybe for the as a janitorial staff for the house. I have seen at least one example in which the husband, the head of the family, would have intimate relations with that maid, and the justification he gave was that she's my laundry, she's my concubine.
That is sort of an equivalent of what the Western world calls as mistress.
Yeah, that's it. It's the same thing. It's exactly the same
It's
thing.
just justification, basically.
Yes,
They're
it is.
doing what they really want to do.
Mhm.
They're using religion to justify it.
So just recently in Pakistan, we saw an episode of the Sri Lankan manager being brutally murdered.
Yes.
So if you want to speak something about it, because that's the misunderstanding.
Yeah, that is a topic which relates to blasphemy, and blasphemy itself is a very sensitive topic. But there is no explicit punishment mentioned in the Quran or the Hadith regarding blasphemy. Not a single. There's not a single verse, and this is agreed upon by the rest of the authorities as well. To them, what happens is when a Muslim actually does this act, he actually does not remain a Muslim. He becomes an apostate, and all apostates are to be punished by death. And if a non-Muslim does so, then he loses his security or sense of security which was given to him by virtue of being a human life. He loses that, and therefore he's subject to death. And whereas I said, there is not a single verse in the Quran that can be pointed out to say that the Prophet ever meant so. You can see in the Meccan period such oppression being the Sahaba being subjected to such oppression that Ammar bin Yasir, the famous companion, you know what had happened to him. His four limbs, his hands and both his feet, they were tied with ropes to camels, and they were asked to run in opposite directions. And he was, everything got torn off his body. And there were several other tales of oppression as well. But you will never find the Prophet ever reacting, even in Medina. Again, there are certain episodes which took place in Medina, but they were entirely, regarding the law that we just discussed, regarding the messengers of God, in which there were people who were subject to high treason. They had they had breached their agreement, and they had actually rebelled. They had tried to bring other tribes to Medina and have them attack. So that is an entirely different category, which is mentioned in certain hadith literature. Otherwise, as far as blasphemy per se is concerned, there is not a single Quranic directive or hadith which ever says. Yes, it does. We as a common sense, we would say that we have to be respectful to all personalities, and we must give the benefit of the doubt. Even if a person does so and he repents or says sorry or presents a new argument, that has to be acceptable. But the modern form of blasphemy, in which you just don't give the person even a chance to speak in his own defense, even if he is repentful or even if he wants to sort of reinterpret his action, and you just put him to death, that has no basis. And as you might have heard, that our own teacher has pointed this out, that even the Hanafi law is against this, the law which is practiced in Pakistan.
Could you just explain a little bit about how it's said in the Quran that a man can have up to 4 wives at one time?
Right. So
And
you see,
what are the requirements?
this is what the Quran has said, that people used to get married before the Quran was revealed to more than one wife. They had 6, 7, 8 or 9 wives, and polygamy was in practice in Arabia before even the Quran was revealed. So what happened was, in the times of the Prophet, especially in Medina, when a lot of women became widows and their children became orphans, the Quran said that, well, you do marry for several other reasons. If there is another reason for which you can marry, is that if you would like to become guardians of these orphans, you can marry their mothers, and therefore this would be much easier for you to take care of these orphans if you marry their mothers. But if you do so, then don't go beyond 4 and think that you have to do justice with each of these wives. And if even for this noble objective, if you cannot do so, then you must not even think of marrying them. So the whole idea of the Quran is that basically multiple marriages or more than one marriage, as far as 4 is concerned, it is allowed. And the Quran has brought this to be as a subject, that in case that there is some need, then you have to be just between the wives, and at the same time not cross 4, and also not make this excuse that because you're doing as a favor to the other party, then you will not give meher to that party. You'll have to give meher in all sorts. But again, this is a contingent situation. Otherwise, as we know that the Quran says that an ideal family comes into being through a single man and woman, it's only certain contingencies, certain I would say options which arise in society, which can entail that you marry more than one wife. But it's not a recommendation.
It's not.
It's
Because
not a
I think
recommendation.
in the Quran, there
It's
is
not
one place where it says it's better to have.
I mean, it says that if you cannot do so, that you must not do so. In one place, it says that what is being asked for you is to be just in your behavior, in your attitude. You are not being required to say that you should love all 4 wives equally, because this is something you cannot have power of. I mean, loving someone is not. I mean, cannot be apportioned. So that is what the Quran said later on in verse 127. It said that walau harastum, even if you try, you will not be able to love each of them equally. So what is required for you to do is to treat them equally, to, for example, give them equal time, or to give them equal allowance, by the way. And this is an area in which we have to be very careful about.
So men who marry a second time without getting the permission of the first wife.
I would say that this is something which is, although not mentioned in the Sharia, but what the Quran tells us in a number of cases is that if there is an issue in which your first wife is going to react, and she's not going to accept the second marriage, even your children are not going to accept this, then if a law is enacted, for example, that without the permission of the first wife, you cannot marry a second lady, or you cannot induct a second marriage. I think it's in the spirit of the Quran itself. Because why would you destroy your family, your first family, and go for another family? If that is what the case is, and you know that it's not going to work, better give the first wife a divorce and then go ahead. Otherwise, it's better that if you seek the permission, because if you live in harmony with both of the wives, and if one of them is not willing to, so you have to accept one of them. I mean, one of them is going to go away in any case. So I think if this law is enacted at the state level, it would be in the spirit of Islam.